Next session of the Cloud Security Masterclass. This time we're going to go deeper into the layers of Amazon S3 security. This is part 2. You can view part 1 on demand. My name is Drew Wright. I'm a co-founder here at Fugue. We have here to walk us through S3 security is my co-founder and CTO here at Fugue, Josh Stella. Before we begin, just wanted to let everybody know about the upcoming Cloud Security Masterclass at the end of this month. This one is going to be focused on bringing your cloud environment into compliance and proving it to management, auditors, anybody that needs to know at any time that your cloud infrastructure environment is compliant. We have joining us for that session, Dave Williams from New Light Technologies, who's done this a lot of times for a lot of different clients of his, getting their cloud environments into compliance. A lot faster, with a lot less pain and headache and business disruption. And we think this is applicable for any organization, any cloud environment, any compliance regime. And it's really kind of targeted toward the cloud engineer, cloud architect, DevOps, et cetera, not necessarily the compliance professionals, although they might get something out of this too. Essentially people who are responsible for compliance, but compliance is not really what their primary role is. So do join us for that. It's going to be, I think, a lot of fun. Let's move on to the agenda, please. Really quick, we're going, I'm going to turn it over here to Josh in a minute. He's just going to kind of set the table about cloud misconfiguration and then get right into a deep dive into the security of Amazon S3. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. But want to let everybody know that the chat is open at all times during this presentation. My other colleague here, Sivya Van Gundy, will be with me in chat, helping to facilitate questions, get your comments in, that kind of a thing. So get those in early and often. Let's make this fun and get right to it. So Josh, what do you have for us?
I was still muted. Okay, thanks, Drew. Thanks, Sivya. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. It would be great, since this is part 2, and we did part 1, and we asked folks, do you want a part 2? We got a lot of yeses. It would be cool if you could raise your hand if you saw part 1. I just want to know how much I need to go and cover a little bit. Okay, we're getting quite a few hands raised. Looks like a mix. I'll do a little coverage, just a review of what we did in part 1 briefly, because today we're going to dig in on really how to think about this problem space in a deeper way and focus on some specific use cases. Thank you for raising your hands. All right, we're going to briefly talk, and when I say briefly, I mean like 1 or 2 slides, on the kind of overall landscape of advanced misconfiguration risks in cloud. So when you're talking about cloud infrastructure security, the main attack vector for bad guys, for hackers, is the configuration of your cloud resources. They're looking for ways to fit into cracks that you left open because you weren't considering them when you did these very complex configurations. And I mean, a lot of cloud environments that we deal with have tens or hundreds of thousands of resources, an S3 bucket being an example of one resource. And they are all interconnected in different ways. And so these kinds of misconfigurations are extremely common, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is the compliance frameworks that are out there, like NIST and CIS and PCI, they miss a lot of them because the world kind of moved on from the data center and they're not really caught up. And what that means is the security teams and the engineering teams who might be reliant on those standards aren't always catching the issues because those standards might not be advising them that they have those issues. So that's one problem. Another problem we see a lot is folks who haven't even used existing compliance frameworks. And so the result of this is these things which are exceedingly easy to overlook, they're needles in constantly regenerating and growing haystacks, are often not seen as problematic, are not flagged, sit out there, and eventually hackers find them. And when I say eventually, it's usually pretty quick. So what the hackers are doing is they're using automation to look for known misconfigurations. So if you have an S3 bucket, in this case, that's not configured properly, they're going to find that, and they're going to find it using automation, which means they're going to find it in minutes. And then you go on a list of things they can go exploit to go after. So these things are very common. When you see the major breaches that hit the news, they are very often related to missing these misconfigurations, whether it's, leaving snapshots unencrypted and read open to assets within the cloud environment is a common one. Another one is IAM role assumption. So when you see these major breaches, they're almost always based on these misconfiguration issues. All right, a little bit of how we think about this. And by the way, the purpose of the Masterclass series is not for me to tell you everything about S3. That's not reasonable. We don't have the time. I don't know everything about S3. No one human on earth probably does, because it's exceedingly complex. So I cannot give you, nor should you want, a cookbook of exactly how to do everything. What I'm going to try to do, what we're going to try to do in these master classes, is get you thinking about the problem space in a way where you can really own your own security posture on the cloud without just relying on other people to tell you things. That's really important, because every use case is slightly different. We are going to do some use cases today, but every use case is slightly different. And you have to be able, as a cloud engineer, or cloud architect, or a security practitioner, to understand how to relate your requirements for your use case to the vast number of ways that you could configure, in this case, the S3 service to meet that use case. So our intention here is to teach you how to reason about the problem space, about the domain, and give you some examples. But primarily, we're trying to get you kind of writing your own music, not playing Mary Had a Little Lamb off of a piece of sheet music. All right, a little bit about how Fugue thinks about this. This is our, climbing the cloud security mountain. This, by the way, is not going to be a product pitch. I just want to share with you how we think about it, because that's going to tell you why I'm inclined in the ways I am, and what we think is the right way to go. As you start out in cloud security, you're going to be at like base camp 1 down here, discovery and posture reporting. You do need some way to go see what you have out there now and whether it's safe or not. Remember, in the prior slide, a lot of these misconfigurations go missed for a long time. Basecamp 2, and we are going to be covering some of that today, you'll see. Basecamp 2 is really about configuration change control and making sure that as things move in your cloud environment and mutate and are added to, you're getting it right and you're able to see what's changing over time and things like that. And then you can keep going up all the way through to shifting left using policy as code and going all the way to full lifecycle automation is the goal. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this other than to say, as I'm talking about S3 security, what we're really talking about is more kind of down here. It's how to get things right and ultimately how to keep them right. Okay, that's all our slides. We got one at the end just with some other events coming up. And I'm going to spend most of this session at a web browser, at the AWS console, at a terminal window, and at a code editor. Now, if any of that sounds scary to you, don't let it. These classes are designed to be approachable almost no matter what your skill level is. It's a master class, but this is, again, it's about how to think about the problem space. So we're going to try to make this highly relatable and understandable. Even if you're not used to looking at code, there's not going to be tons of it, and I'm going to explain every line that's relevant so you get the concepts. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second. One of the things we like to do to keep things a little fun, is we have a contest that we always do. We do these master classes where I'm going to change my Zoom background to something out of kind of geek culture, I guess. Stuff I like, which I assume is geek culture. Mostly like science fiction, video games, history of computing. Now, for those of you who've been here before, we recognized in the last session, I got to turn my light around this way. We recognized in the last session that I needed new backgrounds because you guys were just getting them like this. So it's all new backgrounds today. I'm going to throw the first one up. Before I do that, the way this works is if you're the first person in the chat to say what it is that is on screen behind me, if it's a movie, what movie is it? If it's a computer, what kind of computer was it? These are, I say was it, because these are historical computers. If it's a video game, the name of the video game. If you're the first person in the chat to actually guess or know what it is behind me, I don't think these are super guessable, to be honest. Then Civi is going to send you, we're going to send you a package of swag. And yes, use the chat, not the Q&A, please. And when you answer, chat the answer to all attendees and panelists would be helpful. The first person to get it right wins. You can only win once. So once you've won, stop putting in answers because that'll spoil it for others because you can't win twice in one session. If you've won before at another event, that's fine. You can win again. All right, let's go for, let's start with I think an easy one. All right, so I've got a background up. It is from a video game. If you name the game, we will send you some cool stuff. Up, Eric Maslowski, yes. Death Stranding is correct. Absolutely amazing game, just came out on Steam for the PC. If you haven't played it, highly recommend it. Probably, personally anyway. My favorite game of the last, I don't know, 10 years. Congratulations to Eric. We're going to keep going, and I'm going to reshare my screen, and we're going to dive in a little bit here. I want to start with a whiteboard. I want to start with some very basic concepts in cloud security. So when you think about configuring resources to be safe and secure on cloud, hold on, I've got to get my chat window back up. Come on. All right, there we go. You really have to have a mental model and a framework. If you saw the IAM Masterclass episode 1, this will look familiar. But when you look at AWS in particular, there's so many moving parts. It's easy to just get lost in the weeds. So I'm going to try to go up a level and talk about the kind of fundamentals of S3 security. So the first thing I want to bring up is I mentioned in the last class in session 1 that there are 5 layers of S3 security. So I'm going to just go ahead and fill the first one in, but if you know any of them, put them in the chat. So the first one is ACLs, access control lists. Amazon tells you to really not use these anymore. And the reason is these predate things like IAM and the more sophisticated bucket policies. So I'm giving you hints on some of the other 5. These are really a holdover from the early days of S3, which was one of the very first services. So Bill says bucket policies. Yes, bucket policies. And we're going to be talking quite a bit about bucket policies today and how to think about them. All right, number 3, I'm just going to throw it up here since I'm not seeing a lot in the chat. S3 policy. Neil says S3 policy. There are a number of kinds of S3 policies, bucket policies being one, and there are some other like block public, no, I'm not going to say that one. ACL. Lifecycle policies, that's true. That's a good point. I wasn't going to cover lifecycle because it's not really concerned. You can make an argument that it is concerned with security, but not primarily for filtering access to things. So I'm going to put in here IAM policies. I'm going to put in here, let's see if we got any group policies, inline policies, endpoint policies, in the ballpark, but I'm specifically talking about things that are just focused on S3, not kind of ways to do things like IAM. So let's talk about briefly access points. And then finally, and this gets its own thing because it's its own thing, the feature known as block public access. Come on, computer. So these are the 5 I'm going to talk about. Some folks brought up things like replication policies. Yeah, Vishal, block public access is good. Endpoint, yeah. Public access and private access are, somebody said public access versus private access. Those are typically, there are lots of ways, there are 2 ways at least to do those. One is through ACLs, right? The other is through bucket policies. So the reason I'm using these 5 is every single S3 bucket is going to have at least 2 or 3 of these that every request is going through. So let's talk for a minute about the request and access and policy model in AWS. And this is true for S3. It's also true for everything else. So when you think about accessing an action or a resource, an action on a resource in AWS, there is a default policy from Amazon. Does anyone know what it is? Okay, the default policy from Amazon, yes, Keith Roberts said, correct, deny. Deny is the default policy. Don't let anything happen. And I'm going to show you how this plays out with S3. So what are we denying? In the AWS world, it's called a principal. There are some exceptions to this, but to keep it simple, we'll say it's a principal. Now, the second thing, what are you actually talking to? What are you trying to do? Yeah, deny egress. Yep. Good comments in the chat. I see we've got some experienced practitioners over there. There are 2 categories of kind of objects that you can target when you're that a principal, like a user, a principal is an actor, like a user, you know, or a process that's hosted in the cloud, or maybe some subsection of, you know, of internet CIDR blocks. They don't really call those principals, but I think mental model wise, you know, it's a good idea to think of them that way. These are the people and actors who can access stuff. So what's the stuff? Well, the second thing are actions. Okay, and every AWS service has a definition of what actions it supports. You'll see these when you're creating IAM roles, which we'll look at briefly, shortly rather. There are things like, can I do a read? Can I do a list? There are thousands of actions. And then at the end, we have resources. So a resource, and we're going to focus on 2 specific resources today. Hopefully we get to both, but something like a particular S3 bucket. That bucket is a resource, right? And that bucket, because it is of the type S3 service, has a bunch of actions that can be turned on or off for different principles. All right, so this, I think, mental model of you have principles that do actions on resources, it's default deny, so you need some way to do allows, because in the AWS world, as we evaluate through the policy stack, which today will largely focus on things like IAM access to S3, as well as things like bucket policy access to grants to, you know, the whole internet, things like that. What we're doing is we're opening up allows And then we have additional opportunities to restrict those using later policies. If there's any deny in the chain, it's a deny. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today, I got to keep switching screens here to get to my notes with my organized thoughts. Right. What we're going to focus on today, obviously, is S3 specifically. We're going to get pretty far down in the weeds. And I'm going to start with a fairly common and simple use case, just to show you the basics here. And that is, I want the internet to be able to only read stuff in a bucket. All right. That's what we're going to start with. So the principle is the whole internet. It's everyone in the world. And we want to allow read that action. It's actually more than one action. We want to allow that to this particular resource. Okay. And therefore, we're not going to use IAM because we can't expect the whole internet to have IAM access. That brings up an interesting point, right? If all we have are principles and actions and resources, how do we deal with a principle that's not in IAM? We deal with it through allow blocks in policy against internet address blocks, IPs, or against, in this case, we're going to do it for everyone. Okay, so let's dive into that one real quick. Oh, I went right to my code editor. Okay. So what I'm doing here, actually that's more helpful for the next use case. I can show you here. This is just a Fugue developer. It's the free version of our product. What I want here, these are S3 buckets. We do this automatic diagramming for you. I find it handy. This test public read only bucket, you can see its attributes over here. And what I want to do is have this thing accessible from the internet, but read only. Okay, so let's go and take a look at this. Test public read only. All right, let's look at permissions. It doesn't have any. We'll talk a little bit about block public access, but I really want to focus right now on bucket policies because that's the right place to do this in AWS. Now you can do it with an ACL, but I don't recommend it. The reason I don't recommend it is you now have multiple places to look to understand the access policies for your S3 bucket. I'm a big advocate that every S3 bucket should have a bucket policy, and that bucket policy is canon on what is allowed on that bucket, ignoring everything else, right? So going back to our diagram, oops, got my screens backwards. Back to our diagram, we can put a bucket policy right here. And that gives us one place to understand what is allowed and what is not allowed, regardless. I said irregardless. It's not a word, even though they put it in the dictionary this year. Regardless of what things like IAM grants will do for you. Now, why would you do that and not use an ACL or put it in IAM? Well, you do want to put it in IAM too, but IAM is something you really can't control across your whole organization, not effectively. I know people claim to. I have yet to see it in life. Bucket policies, you know, if there is a deny in that bucket policy, no matter what the IAM permissions are that are generated by somebody, that bucket policies denies and allows, particularly the denies, are going to override that. Okay, we're almost halfway through. So real quick, I'm going to show you the super simple bucket policy, which is right here, for letting everyone on the internet read that object. So here, all we're granting is get object. Now, when we think about what we're granting, so remember I said actions. So here's the principles is star. All right, we can just put these on the diagram actually. So the principle over here is, you know, I said infinity, but we'll use the star. So we've got star, and actually what the specific action is get object, right? And it is against this particular S3 bucket whose name is test public read only. I'm going to abbreviate that. Test public read only. All right, so when I attach that bucket policy, so let's go make sure I'm telling you the truth. Let's prove it as we go. When I attach this bucket policy, what it should do is grant access to everyone. You'll notice in here, I do want to rearrange my screens because this is really throwing me off. There we go. In here under permissions, there's no warning that this thing is public. Well, watch what happens now. So put another way, I can't get to this stuff over the internet. If I try to, let's go to one of the objects I've stuck in this bucket. I just put some photos in here. If I try, so this is the object URL. This is the universal resource locator for that particular image. If I select that in my web browser, I get an access denied because remember, default is deny. So the way we've created this bucket, we did not open up anything during creation. We just created, and by the way, this is an unencrypted bucket because here I've got public data. I don't care, right? This is intended to be public. I'll show you the bucket policy real quick, and then we'll talk about some other decisions we made when we created this bucket. The way I do that, and I'm going to do it on the graphical console because I'm not sure everyone is comfortable with command line, and it might be a little less. Where is it? Oh, I've selected the object, not the bucket. That's why I'm getting. All right, I'm watching the chat here. We've got a really good question. How do you create a balance between access to bucket and all these 5 points to avoid the complexity? That's what I'm trying to show you. All I'm doing is one of the 5. This configuration that I'm showing you is one of the 5. It's just the bucket policy. I would argue that if you want to work with S3 safely, you need to master bucket policy because that is where a lot of your work is going to get done. Most of the other 5, of the 5 we brought up, what are we going to focus on today? Obviously, we're going to focus on bucket policies because we're doing a public-facing bucket. We are going to focus on IAM policies. That's most of what we're going to focus on today. So these other 3 ACLs, just forget about them. You don't need to worry about it. So that's one off your list. Okay. Access points, I will talk later about what they're for, but you probably don't need them. You might, but you probably don't. I'll talk about using this public bucket, a case where you might. And then block public access, I'll describe some, but it's no silver bullet. Okay. It's a cool feature. You can turn it on. It's a big button you turn on and off. So it's super easy, but it doesn't actually solve most of your security problems. And I'll explain a little bit why. So the key to simplifying this stuff, how do you create that balance? That's the right way, is how you think about this. AWS has thrown all kinds of tools at you. Use the ones that are the most appropriate. And that requires some judgment. In the case of public buckets, anything that's hosting public data, man, bucket policies are your best friend there. But you're going to need them no matter what. And I'll show you why later. For stuff that is not public, that you're using in your applications, IAM policies combined with bucket policies are where you want to start. So that's how you create that balance. Is hopefully I'm guiding you to that balance. That's my job today. I hope I live up to it. All right, let's go into the bucket policy. So I've just gone to the bucket and then permissions, and I'm going to assign a bucket policy. Now I showed you a moment ago in my code editor. The principal is star. Remember, that's on the left. The action is S3 get object. That's action in the middle, and the resource on the right is the ARN AWS S3 test public read only, which is my bucket name, and then /star means anything in it. I'm just going to grab this little chunk of JSON. By the way, policies are pretty much painful to write. They're not a real language, and this thing is your friend. It will guide you. There are tools out there. If you're doing something simple like this, it's pretty easy. But as you get more complex, and hopefully I won't get an error. Okay, I didn't get an error. It reformatted my JSON for me. Thank you, Amazon. I didn't get an error. It applied the policy, but now it's warning me. You see this thing lit as public. The reason is I put this principal star in here. So This is related to block public access. Amazon interprets like open to world or big wildcards as potential public access, but it doesn't interpret it, some other things that are. Now, in this case, we want this public. So let's go make sure that it's working as intended. We'll go back to the overview and we'll grab an image. And if you remember, I got an access denied before. Well, now I get an image, okay? And that is the simplest use case for how to do facing you can library those things and run another place to look, and you will get confused because, as Vahid pointed out, you know, the multiple layers can make things a little confusing.
Hey, Josh.
Yes.
You got a little robotic there for a minute. Can you repeat that last statement about how people can get confused?
By using too many of the layers. Avoid them. Simplify. I'm going to argue, as I have, that bucket policies are your friend. ACLs are not. It's another layer. It will create confusion if that ACL comes into some kind of conflict with a policy later and you're looking at the bucket policy and the ACL has some other rules in it. They're going to interact in ways that you're not necessarily going to expect, and you have to look multiple places. So that was real simple, but let's talk about some other choices we made on that public bucket, okay? So we're going to go into properties. I chose not to actually build this stuff in front of you today because it takes some time. But I just want to show you some of the choices I made here. So in versioning, oh, is my voice still breaking up, Drew?
Yes, you are breaking up a bit.
I'm going to have to go off video. I guess I'm having a bad.
Yeah.
All right. Is that any better?
Yep. You sound fine now.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the properties. We did turn versioning on. I'm a fan of doing this because it allows you to recover. Versioning just means that when a object that already exists, a new version with the same name is posted, AWS will save the old version. That's a good thing to do. It's going to cost you a little in storage, but S3 storage is unless you're talking with really big data sets, is not going to be a huge problem. In this case, I did turn on object level logging. I think you should do this. I'm pumping to a cloud trail for every single activity that happens against that bucket. That's a good idea. You should do that. On encryption, I had three choices here. I actually lied to you a minute ago unintentionally. I said this was not encrypted. It is encrypted, but it's encrypted using AES 256 using server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. Okay. What is that as compared to KMS, right? This is a public-facing bucket. The way server-side encryption works is when the bits are at rest inside of S3, they're encrypted using keys that you don't have access to as a customer. And if you have permission through the bucket policy, et cetera, to access that data, it will get decrypted before being sent to you, okay? So if you want encryption at rest, but you don't want, and you want people without having KMS access, like public internet users, to have access to that data, this is your choice, okay? For private data, you definitely want to use KMS, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. All right, let's, actually, let me talk about those reasons for a second. When you encrypt using KMS keys, what that means is that bucket policy is no longer good enough, right? All this is saying is grant the world the get object action on this S3 bucket. But if you use KMS encryption, you would, that user hitting that object would also have to hit the KMS service to negotiate that decryption. Not good for public, very good, I would argue, definite best practice and even required for anything private. And we are going to do a private use case, by the way. All right, I'm going to close these guys and go back to my diagram just for a quick recap. So this whole, remember, default is deny. So internet was getting denied, got that access denied. But then on this bucket policy we put right here, we said, hey, actually, internet can do get object, right? What can internet not do on this S3 bucket? Let's go and switch over. I'm going to switch to IAM because it's the most convenient place to show you the action list, the stuff you're going to think about putting in that bucket policy, okay? So I'm going to make a policy just to show you what this list looks like. And I'm going to choose S3. And here you see actions, okay? Don't ever use all, please. Don't ever use all. Let's look at reads. The reason you should not use all is it's very hard to know the consequences of that decision. If you look at the number of things just in read, the number of actions just in read, you can see we just did that guy. That was it. We also didn't allow lists, okay? We didn't allow any of these list actions. That's important because list actions, well, on a public bucket, it probably doesn't matter as much, but generally speaking, lists can be used to do discovery against your infrastructure and your data, and hackers love it when you give them the ability to understand what's going on. So we just chose this one object out of, one action rather, out of a whole lot. So if you look at the number of actions in S3, you know, we've got, oh, around 100. It's actually not too bad. EC2 is much more complex. So that's where we got that get object from, was that list of actions. There's a canonical list for every service, and that's what the policy language is going to speak to. All right, I'm going to take a quick break from screen sharing before I move on to my next use case. And I'm going to do another background here. And we did a video game. Let's do something from the history of computing. All right, what computer is this? Oh, Jonathan Burlbach nailed it. It is a Next station. Yes, it is a Next Cube. As an old Next geek, the Cube was the awesome one. The station was the pizza box. These are also cool. But this was the Cube. Really, really, really neat computer. Yeah, congrats, Jonathan. Okay, we do have a question here. Since the bucket, oh, I scrolled right past it. This is from Vishal. Since the bucket is publicly exposes to all principals, do we really need encryption of data at rest? I would argue that from any practical perspective, no. You're right. Who cares? If you have read access, you don't even need KMS keys to, you're not doing any decryption. There's no second line of defense. However, there are people, I used to work at AWS, there are people that are worried about, like, well, could an AWS employee read my data? Or maybe you live in a regulatory or compliance world where data encryption at rest is like a checkbox requirement. So practically speaking, I don't think it makes any difference. But you may need to do it anyway. Okay, we're gonna go back to screen sharing. And I'm gonna turn my video back off so I don't sound like a robot anymore. And we're gonna talk about another use case, okay? In this use case, we have another S3 bucket, but this one serves a very different purpose. This S3 bucket is called important records. And what we're going to do with this S3 bucket is we're never going to expose it to the public. We're actually going to read and write to this S3 bucket from other parts of our application. So for example, we at Fugue do this. Our app itself stores significant amounts of its own data in S3. And there's no reason for anything other than our application to ever get access to that S3 bucket. So what I want here is, we'll just call this program. It's going to happen as an IAM role or an IAM policy where we do some grants to some actions. Okay, so this program that's running on EC2, and I'm going to show you all this. When you have an EC2 instance or a container or a Lambda function that needs to access stuff in AWS, you can assign it an IAM role. So remember, default is deny, right? And we poked a hole here with that bucket policy for the internet to that one. In this one, okay, I'm gonna, somebody asked a good question in the chat. I'm gonna finish my thought and then I'll answer your question. So in this one, we wanna poke a hole, but only for the compute resources in our program running in AWS, right? We wanna poke a hole through these, this deny everything. We wanna get some allows here against some actions, all right? And in this case, we want a few more because we wanna be able to read and write to important records, and we want everyone else blocked. All right, so our second use case then is, let me just show you in more specific detail. Let's close that guy. So what we want here, we have two compute instances in two different VPC networks. By the way to read this diagram, and this is just, like I said, Fugue developer, you can get these diagrams of your infrastructure for free, check it out. But over here on the left is the internet. We're going through an internet gateway into an EC2 instance, which has an endpoint connection into S3 and important records there. And then we have another EC2 instance running in a different VPC network. And here I'm saying not in the right VPC. I'll explain that in a minute. So what we want is for this thing to be able to do read writes here, but nothing else to be able to do read writes there. Okay, the question from Amar, you are advocating for bucket policies and IAM policies, still not getting pitfall of ACLs, access points, and block public access on S3. Okay, can I elaborate? Okay, the only one I've told you you should not use, in my opinion, is ACLs. And that's because it's effectively deprecated. You can do anything you could do with ACLs with few exceptions. You can do with bucket policies and IAM roles and shared IAM roles and things like that. And it's kind of a historic artifact. And AWS themselves tell you, you probably should not use it. So that's one off the list. Block public access, you probably should use at times. I'm just saying it's kind of a ham-fisted approach and it doesn't actually solve the whole problem, but I use it, we use it. It's worth using. It's just not top of mind. And I'll explain what it does later if we have time. Access points, I didn't say don't use them. I said you probably don't need them. Access points are a way to have different URLs on a single bucket with different bucket policies, okay? So if we had this test public read only, right? That's the one we were just working with. If I want, let's say that was epidemiology data on COVID, and I wanted the whole internet to be able to read it, but I only wanted research scientists at specific universities and laboratories to be able to publish new data to it. I have two different sets of permissions now. Now I could put those all in one bucket policy, but a cleaner way to do it is to make access points, one for the public with one bucket policy and one for the folks who need read-write using another bucket policy and just point them to the access points. So I didn't say you shouldn't use it, but it's kind of a specific case. And therefore with 15 minutes left today, not one I'm gonna drill any more into than that. But we want to build this private bucket. Okay, so again, we want this guy to read it and write to it, and this guy not to. Now, how did I configure this? I built my stuff in advance so we could move pretty quick. I have two EC2 instances. Oh, I'm in the wrong region. Two compute instances, and they are both, well, here, I can just show you in the graphical form. It's easier to see. This legit app instance belongs to S3 read write. That's its IAM instance profile. So the way here, we're not granting any access using a bucket policy, okay? We're starting with creating an IAM policy and mapping it to the instance profile here to give these compute resources the ability to see S3. And you can see here, S3 read write is on both of them, okay? So when I go, I'm gonna go ahead and shell into those boxes. So I'm just secure shelled in here. This one is this one. All right, yep, it's this one. And let's do this guy. This one is the other one, okay, the one that we don't want to have access to this. All right, so I'm gonna go from the command line here, and I'm just gonna do a simple command to see if I have S3 access. I'm gonna say AWS S3 command line, AWS command line, S3 list. All right, I can see that. Those are my buckets that I saw in my nice Fugue diagram. I'm gonna do a list of what is in important records, right? Because I may not have access to that. In fact, I do have access to that. Now, if I go to this other compute instance, is this going to, does anyone know? They're both AWS S3 read write. Will I be able to get a list of S3 from the other EC2 instance, the one that I don't want to have access, given how I have it configured right now? Oh, shoot. This guy. Okay, someone said no. Well, let's think about the diagram here. Let's think about what we've granted. We've granted a principal over here, which is that S3 read write role. That IAM role is S3 read write. Right? If I have the credentials for S3 read write, I have the action grants, the allows for S3 read write. So actually it is going to let me do that because that's the only filtering I've applied so far. So even though I'm in the quote unquote wrong VPC network, if I have those S3 credentials via the IAM policy and the role association profile, then I'm going to get access to that. Well, I don't want that, right? I want only the correct compute instance. I don't want someone else in my organization's application to be able to read what's in my and write to what's in my S3 bucket, right? Worse than that, if I can get the credentials for that IAM role, I could actually do this over the internet, okay? Somebody's saying we need role policy. Could you do it that way? You might be able to, but there's a simpler way. And this is why I'm going to argue at the end of the day, there's a more deterministic way. I'm a big fan of surety and determinism. So I've got another bucket policy here, okay? I'm going to put this on that S3 bucket. So remember, we're giving with allows and we're taking away with denies. So here's that important records bucket name, right? Again, it's the principal is any principal, the action S3 anything in this case, okay? Against this particular S3 bucket, this resource, the bucket and its contents, all right? I'm saying deny all actions to all principals against this bucket everywhere in the world. If I stop there, that S3 bucket has disappeared from my ability to ever see it again. So don't do that. You want to add some conditions. So the deny is in effect for everything, unless the string not equals my VPC endpoint name, okay? So this endpoint right here, okay? This guy cannot talk through this endpoint. It's in a different VPC network, all right? But this guy is talking through that VPC endpoint. So essentially what I'm saying with this policy is you need to meet two conditions for me to allow your actual action to successfully take place against that resource. You need to be going through that VPC endpoint, and you need to have an IP address that is legitimate from that VPC network. All right, let's apply this bucket. We're going to see some interesting results here, by the way. It's going to be fun. Here we go. Let's go back here, and we'll do S3. And let's go to important records. And let's go to permissions, and we'll go to our bucket policy. And hopefully I don't have a typo. I did test this earlier. AWS will tell me if I'm wrong. All right, that looked good. Well, let's go back to our two compute instances, right? And let's try that again. All right, I can get it from there. Oops. Did that stick? Ah, it did stick. It would help if I typed the commands correctly. I have confused myself. Am I in the wrong region or something? So here you can see it right here. Oh, I know why, because I need to recycle my credentials there. So important records now is showing error. And that is because the console itself we're getting some eventual consistency issues here. Yeah, here you go. Error, the console's access is denied. Okay, so only now that particular, where did I put it? Only now that particular instance can see what's in important records because it is going through the correct endpoint and has the correct IP address. All right, I see we have some chat going on. Okay, good question from Terrence. Why is it necessary to specify both the bucket and its contents? Wouldn't one imply the other? No, it won't. You can have variance in terms of all kinds of variance in terms of controls over objects in S3 buckets and the buckets themselves. The matter is, if you have general policy for bucket, for read and write, there's a reason to make it that explicit. Yeah, exactly. I mean, so the way I think about this, back to this model, is you don't want to proliferate a bunch of different IAM policies. You don't want to write like IAM policies that are bound to particular resources that have them hard-coded into them. That's painful and really painful to manage. And one of the ways you get out of security compliance, okay, is by having too much complexity that you can't manage in your infrastructure. So if you've got 27 different IAM policies defined for access to different groups of S3 buckets, well, that's going to get really complex. But if every S3 bucket has a policy on it that is the final say, that is always attached to that S3 bucket, it's not going to get lost out into the wilds of your your long list of IAM policies. The bucket names change. Now you got to go change it in the policy name. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So this class is really about how to do this stuff and make your life reasonable and not a living hell of configuration management, which is easy to do on AWS, by the way. All right. So we've got from Michael, out of curiosity, when you get an error like that, does it have a code you can use to troubleshoot the error if the behavior of your rules is unexpected? Sometimes. That actually is a whole bucket of worms. Okay, that's that one. Let me go and try to get to a I'm not going to find it there right now. So you saw the error in the console was just error. I put a pretty brutal bucket policy on there. So I'm not going to be able to see anything in here. I mean, it's telling you the error is that your access is denied, right? It is telling you that. Why that is, you would have to diagnose probably from something that has access. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind. So we do have a compute instance over here that has perfectly good access. Is it that guy? I think it's that guy. It's not Unix, Josh, it's AWS. You can't do an ls-l. So here, because I have access to S3 from this compute instance, I could do some diagnosis from here to do things like, I mean, if we just type AWS S3, oh, come on. Trying to remember, I think it's just help, but you can go to the command line, where is it? Where did I put my browser? There we go. So in here, you will see a number of things you can do. There's also a command line for AWS S3 API command line. And here's where you can do a whole lot of plunking around. So for example, if you wanted, where is it? This guy, get bucket policy. If you can't read it in the console, let's take a look at AWS S3 API get bucket policy, and then let's just grab this guy and see what we get, okay? So this is always something you worry about in life, in computing, is with security, is that you kind of back yourself out of the ability to blind yourself to the ability to fix things. That's kind of hard to do here, but you may not like the way you have to go about it. Let's just let's not do that. Let's just type it once. All right, so there's our bucket policy, right? So we could, in this case, we still have access to it from that appropriate VPC network, right? We can still go, I was sitting in here and I can get access to it because that has access. So that's a pretty, pretty intense bucket policy. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing and do one more background real quick, and we're out of time and we're losing some folks. So I'll do one more background and then we'll wrap up. All right, let's do another video game. Going way back in the day. Oh man, Ethan. Oh no, Chris pipped him. Yes, Chris Isa. It is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Absolutely awesome game. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing screen. Sorry, we ran a bit long, but we got some good questions. So some upcoming stuff. The next one, as Drew and Sylvia mentioned, is on bringing your cloud environment into compliance and proving it. I'm really excited about this one because we've got this brilliant partner and customer of ours who's been just doing this for lots of great companies, and he's going to walk us through it. So you're going to get someone else's perspective in the next masterclass. And then we've got some available stuff on demand as well. So thanks very much for attending. It looks like we've got a poll.
Yeah, so one thing Sylvia and I wanted to kind of throw out there, just wanted to gauge interest among the folks on this session regarding a potential half-day virtual event, free event, focused on cloud security and cloud infrastructure compliance, where we would be bringing together thought leaders, leading practitioners in this space to really kind of dig into the technical issues, challenges, tips, etc. So yeah, would love to find out from folks whether that is something that would interest you. We're currently thinking about doing something like that. With a squarely a focus on cloud infrastructure security and compliance. So, and while we have Josh still on the line, if anybody has any additional questions for him about this topic or AWS security in general, please get that into the chat.
All right, somebody said, I think our slide is confusing. So these ones here, somebody said, why do part two when part one hasn't been done yet? These ones on the right are ones that we already did and are available on demand. So you can just go watch them. They're from the past, so they're on demand. But we record all these, like we're recording this one now, and this one will later become available on demand. So we're kind of building a library of these for you. Okay. Somebody, Gled asked, any other great resources to look at conflicts between IAM and bucket policies, such as reInvent YouTube? Maybe, might be some folks are answering. Well, okay. So yeah, somebody said S3 Analyzer is a great tool. That's true. You can do that, right? You can do that. The intention of this class is to make it so you can actually reason about this stuff. And I think that's important, rather than like throwing stuff against the wall to see if it works and then finding out why it doesn't. I mean, we all do some of that. But if you just think through this model, in my view, most of your problems can be resolved by going step by step from the left to the right. Understanding what the principle is, how that applies via its IAM or other kinds of access, typically IAM or IP address. And then looking at the bucket policy and seeing where those things are going to potentially, they don't conflict, right? We're not talking about conflict, we're talking about desired behavior, which is the ability in the bucket policy to filter away those allows that the IAM policy granted based on the context. And I didn't really get into it, but every time an action is taken in AWS, you don't just have the principle, you also have the context of that action. And that includes things like the IP address and other things as well. So I really think it's a good idea to start with trying to figure these things out on your own rather than using tools and analyzers that debug the flow. That said, you definitely want to use tools to find out where you have vulnerabilities. That is a real difficult and vast problem. Are there a platform to automatically, I'm going to think this means assert cloud policies? Excuse me. I mean, the policies you're really going to, if you're talking about things like bucket policies and IAM policies, you really want to craft those and understand what you're doing. What we can help you do, if you desire, is tell you where. That's not a good example. I'm just showing you the free developer version of Fugue. You can point Fugue at your existing cloud, and we will tell you where you've got things like dangerous IAM roles and dangerous S3 buckets. We've painted these guys red. If I select that, bucket versioning and lifecycle policy should be enabled. We're gonna tell you where you've done things that are unsafe according to a whole bunch of compliance standards and policies, and we do that for free for you. So So there's tools like us. That's what we do for a living. But in terms of like generating correct policies, you know, if you think about the policy that I put on here, you know, that was very specific, very use case specific. So it really is something you need to get good at on your own, I would say. But that said, don't let this stuff scare you. It's not hard. It's just complicated, right? And if you can understand what to think about in what order and knock down the problem into smaller problems, notably, I gave you the formula. It's deny everything. Typically, IAM is going to give some allows, and then additional policies are going to put more denies back in. It's like a pachinko machine. And you can just trace that. You can look at it, and it's really not super complex. You can make it complex by having like 20,000 character bucket policies that try to handle every edge case. You should not do that. That's where access points come in. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to reason about this. The complexity is in the number of actions, which ones you need, and you know which S3 resources need exactly what. All right, I'm not seeing. Okay, somebody asked me the AWS Solutions Architecture Associate exam has several ACL questions still. Will that change, you think, in the future? I doubt it. I mean, like they probably want you, I don't know, I don't work at AWS anymore. I haven't in a long time. You know, I maybe, you'd have to ask them, but ACLs do still exist. They just tell you not to use them. And I've found in my own life, you know, using them definitely makes things trickier, because I got, you know, I'll be like, why isn't this working? Oh, I've got a bucket policy, I've got an IAM policy, they seem right, it's still not working. Oh, it's friggin' ACL sitting over there I forgot to look at because this one bucket has an ACL on it. So I think that's really why I don't like them. But who knows if they'll remove them from the tests. You may as well learn it if you're going to get certified. It's not hard, by the way. It's not hard. It's not hard to build. They just are painful to live with for the reason I just gave you. You'll forget they're there, and they can create entropy, the great enemy of determinism. All right, if there are no other questions, I think we're ready to wrap up. Thanks, everyone. I got to tell you, I really appreciate everyone who comes to these. This is one of my favorite parts of my job, and we're going to be doing a lot more of it. And hopefully it's of value. Please do let us know. By the way, I'm just josh@fugue.co. Feel free to reach out to me via email or on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear what's working, what's not working, things you'd like us to cover, ways we could improve. We've been very pleased that folks seem to value these. So thank you very much for attending.
Yeah, I echo that too. Thank you, everybody, for participating in these. Obviously, they wouldn't be the same without you. So, and would love to hear feedback. You know, reach out to Josh. I'm drew@fugue.co. You can reach out to me as well. And again, we'd love to see you at upcoming sessions. Definitely come out to our one on July 30th on cloud compliance. We think it will be very useful for pretty much anybody out there that has to worry about compliance regimes or internal company policies that they need to adhere to. So hopefully we'll make that process a lot less painful for everybody that needs to make that happen. So we'll see you then. And thank you again. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Sivia.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
y'all.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your day.
Keep on keeping on.